While the name may be very uninspiring, the vehicles they produce are some of the benchmarks in their respective automotive genres. For performance, for luxury, and for fun. BMW's M Division. Come the 1970s, with the success of the 2000 series, BMW was well and truly back on their feet, and they began to look at motorsport as a viable marketing and R&D tool once again. Now, they could have turned the 2002 into a racing car. Heck, Alpina did that around the same time frame as this, but they decided instead to focus on their E9 series coupe and turn it into a touring car. But BMW had no one to design or build it, so they created a department just to do that. And since this was their factory motorsport division, and since they're German, they called their motorsport division M for motorsport. And in May of 1972, 35 of BMW's most talented engineers piled into a garage with an E9 coupe. And what emerged for the European Touring Car Championship was the 3-liter CSL. First off, this is one of my favorite BMWs of all time. I mean, it's called the Batmobile. It was the original Batmobile. I know Lamborghinis and whatnot are called Batmobiles nowadays, but this, well and truly, was the OG Batmobile if Batmobiles were production cars. I love this thing. It's amazing. It sounds great. It's incredible in terms of its performance for the era and the bonkers styling. But let's get back to the car. And at 3-liter, as the name might suggest, naturally aspirated straight six, making 206 horsepower on the road and 370 on the track. Now, that's quite a big power disparity. Not many components were really shared. There was a lot of tuning going on. But one thing that the road car and the track car did share was the bodywork. You see, the aerodynamics had to be homologated for the race car. Now, no one in touring cars was crazy enough to sell a road car that looked like a crazy winged beast. BMW were crazy enough, except for the wing. Technically, that was illegal in Germany. However, they figured out that if you put the wing in the trunk with an installation kit, it was allowed. So they literally stuffed the wing in the trunk with a bunch of tools and said, here's how you install it, but we can't do it for you. Now, I should point out the name. We know where the 3-liter came from, and we know that CS is one of their performance monikers. But what about the L? Usually that means long wheelbase for BMW, but not with the 3-liter. Here it means light. That means the body was made out of thinner steel, the bodywork, aluminum, the windows, perspex, and any and all sound deadening were removed along with pretty much everything else that was not essential. Only 1,200 of these were ever made, and they're some of the most sought-after BMWs of all time. But this was an M Division project, which was first and foremost designed for the track. In the European Touring Car Championship, where it competed primarily, it won every single championship between 1973 and 1979, except for 1974. Can't win them all, I guess. And it also competed in Group 5 touring cars for the FIA Racing Series, and it scored a class victory at Le Mans, just for a cherry on top. Not bad for their first project, but I hinted that they raced in Group 5, and, well, the 3-liter, as great as it was no match for the Porsche 911s, and they were getting absolutely trounced. So BMW decided to build a sports car out of the blue. Now, this was the first official M Division project. They were still sort of sorting out the name and everything when they started the 3-liter. So this is the first actual M project. Sort of. You see, BMW couldn't justify building 400 cars from scratch for homologation, so they decided to partner with Lamborghini to build it, but then Lamborghini got sidetracked with this weird US military contract and sort of forgot about BMW, so BMW sort of said screw it and built the cars themselves. Now, since this is M Division's first project, and this is one of their first projects for racing following the success of the 2000 series, and since they're German, they called it the M1. Very original. The M1 was a fully blown mid-engine sports car, and it was amazing. Ironically, they actually built the race car first. Sort of like what Ford did with the GT a few years ago. They built the race car first and then built the road cars after. Now that meant you weren't allowed to compete in FIA Group 5 because homologation hadn't been met yet. But they had all these racing cars, so BMW sort of said, we'll just make a one-make racing series and use it to supplement Formula 1. They called it the M1 Pro Car Championship, and it was raced by actual Formula 1 drivers on the F1 circuits before the Sunday race. And, I mean, this was big names. Niki Lauda won the 1979 Pro Car Championship. And it ran for 2 seasons, just to buy time for the road car homologations. And when that was finally met, the M1 was released upon the world. And it was okay. It competed at Le Mans, few touring car series, and even Group B rallying, with mixed success. It was average. To be honest, the road car is actually much, much better. Only 399 were made, and they are incredible. Fiberglass bodies, double wishbone suspension, adjustable springs, vented disc brakes, and the M88 straight 6 engine with 6 individual throttle bodies attached to a fuel-injected 3.5 liter block, making 273 horsepower. The thing is amazing. Has a top speed of 162, and the styling is still iconic to this day. And it showed that M Division knew what they were doing. Not only could they design a brilliant chassis with a brilliant engine, they can make it work as a package. No one realized just how good the M88 engine would be. And when they did see how good it was, they realized they couldn't just waste it on a single car, so they did the only logical thing. They shoved it in the E12.5 series and called it the M535i, which the next year became this little thing called the M5. It's one of their most famous brands in all of BMW. In fact, the only thing that's more famous than the M5 is the next vehicle they put the M88 in, the 3 Series. But it wouldn't fit, so they cut it into a 4-cylinder, redid the bodywork, the suspension, the brakes, the gearbox, and the interior to make arguably their most famous car ever. I know that I said the M5 was one of their benchmarks. This is their benchmark. This made M Division a household name. The E30 M3 is one of the best cars ever. One of the best sports cars for sure. It's quite possibly the most pure BMW ever made. It decimated touring cars and back roads alike. These things can go for 6 figures now, depending on the mileage. They're some of BMW's best vehicles in their entire history. It's small wonder that it's still their flagships to this day. The M3 and the M5 are BMW's masterstrokes. Cars that, certainly for the E30 and the E28 generations, they may never really eclipse in terms of driving pleasure and pure experience behind the wheel. But in 1993, you gotta evolve, and M Division got a new name. M Division. They started by expanding their road-going operations, with a caveat. Unlike AMG, which sort of just builds everything from sports cars to minivans, BMW's M Division decided to focus on vehicles with lateral agility, i.e. sports sedans and sports cars only. except for SUVs. We'll get to that, we'll burn that bridge later. Luckily, BMW had a lot of sedans and sports cars, and they continued evolving the M3 and the M5 while also introducing new ones, like the Z3M and the Z4M Roadsters. They're not technically M cars, which is why the M is at the back. It's a little weird because they didn't want to confuse the M3 with the Z3. It's some naming mess. This is what happens when you name your vehicles with letters and numbers. But anyway, they were okay. I know certainly the gearbox and some of them were not the best. They were a bit more mainstream than the M3 and the M5. It was, yeah, they're nice cars, not my personal favorites. They also worked on the 850 CSI Grand Touring car, specifically the S70 engine and gearbox. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because it's their first production V12. And while the 850 was stuck with a 5.6-liter version, making a respectable 375 horsepower, but if you want to go bigger, they supplied this S70 6.1-liter naturally aspirated V12 to McLaren for this little first production car they were making called the F1. It made 627 horsepower. It did 241 miles an hour. It is one of, if not the greatest cars ever made. It's the ultimate record breaker. It's one of the dream cars of the dream cars. But it's not the fastest S70 V12. No. It may be the fastest in a straight line, but their racing division for the V12 LMR got a 6-liter version making 580 horsepower. This is the engine that powered BMW's first and only Le Mans win in 1999. It's extremely forgotten about. I don't know why. Seriously, this car's ridiculously fast, ridiculously amazing, and it's BMW's only Le Mans win, so I kind of respect it for being the oddball out at Le Mans. Now, I mentioned that BMW only really did the engine and gearbox for the 850, and that's true. At least it was until 2010. You see, that year, BMW announced something they never announced before. M Division had made an M8. They made an M8 concept in the 90s based off of the 850. It made 640 horsepower to the wheels, which went along with a completely re-sculpted body and reworked suspension. You know, the usual M stuff. Except for the fact that, A, they never made it, which is not uncommon for BMW. They tend to make concepts here and there. But the fact that they hid this for the better part of 2 decades is bizarre. And no one can really explain why. But they did. And I think it's just interesting, this little caveat of BMW history being hidden away for decades. And the fact that their most powerful V12 ever made was in a concept that was hidden away. But there you go. If we can rewind from 2010 to 2000, the gears were starting to turn at M. And not necessarily in a good way. They started making M performance cars, which is sort of like an M car, but not really. And they started making the X5 and the X6 M Division vehicles, which are SUVs, which are not laterally agile, but they sort of made them laterally agile, sort of. They sell well, and that's the nicest thing I can say about them. They also made the 1 Series Coupe, which is brilliant, but they couldn't call it the M1, obviously, again with the confusing name, so they called it the 1M. I mean, they even made their first motorcycle, the M1000RR, which makes a scary 200 horsepower in a motorcycle. But, honestly, I'm not a big fan of this M Division. They have very fast, very turbocharged inline 6s and V8s. And I don't mean to sound old-fashioned, but they are a bit clinical, I think is the word I would say. They are fantastic to drive. I've ridden a few of them. They are utterly brilliant driving machines. And they're very fast, and the M5 can decimate all comers. Even supercars in a sprint to 60. But I think they lost their way in terms of the nostalgic past, if you will. At least until 2015, because then they made the M2. BMW took their standard 2 Series coupe and basically built an E46 M3 with modern technology. It is still a turbocharged straight six, but it makes 365 horsepower to the rear wheels, and it weighs just 3,300 pounds, so it's nimble, and most importantly, it's fun. It actually focuses on driver connection. It's a brilliant return to form. It's not an afterthought where everything has to be the absolute best on the suspension and the handling and the grip. It's just a fun, slidey, rear-wheel drive coupe with a manual. Sure, it's more expensive than its other rivals, but it's a fantastic driver's car. Their GT program has been immensely successful. I mean, they even launched a new Formula Drift team with factory support recently, which is the first for them. I mean, they set the drifting world record 2 years ago, but this is their first actual Formula Drift team, so their M Division is getting bigger on the racing side. It's getting bigger on the road side. The M2, there's the M3, there's the M4, the M5, and the M8, along with all their SUVs. And they're all some of the fastest and best handling cars in their class, and the M2 and the M3 and whatnot are some of the best drivers' cars in the world, even if you can't look them in the eye.